That is judged from any old music. Vaughan-Williams' Dives and Lazarus is a compelling exploration of string writing techniques. It's by no means avant-garde in the string techniques used. It relies on simple effects that are largely built around the concept of divisi, or divided sections. These simple effects are used to dramatically extend the coloristic range of the string orchestra. There is, after all, not only a great difference between instruments and sections of instruments, but also the sound of 1, 2, 3 or 8 of the same, in this case string instrument, but any instrument, and even the particular strings that these string instruments use. The primary concept that underpins Dives and Lazarus is, as I've said, divisi, or divided sections. How then does RVW make this straightforward technique so effective, so potent in this piece? Well, it is in how he specifies these divises and what he asks the players to do in or within these divided sections. To demonstrate how RVW uses divisi, I present 5 examples in no particular order of how he uses the technique. In so doing, I use the following terms to distinguish them. 1. Same strings, different string. 2. Antiphonal voicing. 3. Solo section doubling. 4. Divisi-Section doubling. And 5. Divisi and sub-divisi by desk. So, starting with number 1 then, same strings, different string. Granted, this is a slightly confusing name, however I think it could be quite catchy in a way that makes it more memorable once you get the gist of it. The technique same strings, different string instructs divisi in one part, but all the players still play the same line. Instead, the divisi tells some players to play natural and others sul G, or on the G string. Or it could be any string really, but in this instance, this example, it's the G string of the violins. What this means is half the players play the music how they would without any specification, choosing what strings and thus string position to use for different portions of the melodic line that's written for them. The other half of the string section play the whole line on one string, in this instance, as I've said, the G string. The example on screen demonstrates RVW's use of same strings, different string at the very beginning of Dives and Lazarus. We would usually anticipate the whole section to change or remain on the same string together to create a unified sound. However, when the melodic line goes into a range where the D string becomes available, the tone colour will be subtly different than if they were all playing on the same string. The reason for this is the different qualities of each string on a string instrument. In my trusty orchestration manual, The Study of Orchestration by Samuel Adler, there are descriptions of not only string instruments but the characteristics of individual strings on those string instruments. For the violins, he describes the G string as most sonorous. As the player moves into the higher positions, the sound becomes very intense. Similarly, for the D string, he describes it as mellow, probably the least distinctive, yet it can exude warmth and lyricism. As a result, the divisi here will result in a blend of these timbral qualities. Rather than having a completely sonorous and intense tone had all the strings played sul G, we get a mixture of intensity from the G string and the warmth of that D string. Looking at the example, you may ask, why not just ask the first violins to perform sul G and the second violins to perform natural? Well, I think this links to the second point that we're about to move on, which is antiphonal voicing. Moving on to the second example of RVW's extended use of divisi then, we're now looking at, as I've suggested, antiphonal voicing. In this instance, it's essentially the consideration of panning, or like we might think of it as panning rather. At this time, the standard setup was for violins 1 and 2 to sit opposite one another. On the left of the conductor you would get the first violins, and on the right you'd get the second violins. Nowadays some orchestras still use this setup. I believe it's more popular on the continent in Europe, but I could be wrong with that. And I think it has some popularity with regards positioning in film scoring due to the separation of the two violins on the opposite sides of the stereo field. But many, particularly American orchestras and around the world, prefer the violins first and seconds to be next to each other, so you get the first on the very left hand side of the conductor and then just inside of them you'll get the second violins, as opposed to them being opposite one another. Laying the orchestra out with the violins 1 and 2 opposite each other invites antiphonal thinking, or in other words, it invites one to consider panning as a compositional device or effect. Antiphonal or panning considerations were important to RVW. Another earlier composition, well known, is Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, and this is evidence of his considerations about space and positioning of instruments, the delicacy of that. In writing for different orchestras, he uses the antiphonal textures, call and response textures within this, between 3 different ensembles. One of these is a string quartet, and then he has 2 orchestras. The ensembles occupy different locations within a performance space. As a result, the techniques create distance or 3-dimensionality through the acoustic effect that the spatial positioning imposes. In Dives and Lazarus then, the effect is much more modest, but still significant. The effect is more stereo, right and left, than I guess binaural, where we'll have a bit of depth perception as well. I guess you could almost have height too, depending on how you position the orchestras within a space. Furthermore, it also offers a reasonable answer to our previous question. Why not have one violin section use Sol G and the other natural? This is from the previous section. Well, with regards antiphonal voicing, this is because the violins are sat opposite one another rather than next to each other. Therefore, if you had one section play Sol G and the other play naturale, one side would obviously have the Sol G sound, and you just get that sound on one side, and then the D string on the other side, which would have the mellow lyricism that Adler speaks about in his book. So he wants them to be blended, so he splits each section, so even if they are positioned antiphonally, you will still get that effect. Moving on to the third technique then, solo section doubling. This is the use of a solo string instrument to double a melody line that is also being played by a full or divisi section of one or different kinds of instruments, different sections of instruments. Typically, for this to work best, the solo instrument is in a distinctive and usually stronger register than the other instruments that it is doubling. The reason being that obviously the section has a numerical advantage and the solo is numerically disadvantaged, and thus needs to rely on being particularly more sonorous, or I guess more brilliant sounding, incisive, if it's to add anything to the timbral colour of this passage. The result is similar to the first point in this article, same strings, different string. However, depending on how exactly it's done, it will have a sense of 3-dimensionality. Not actual in terms of space, but how we hear it. What I mean by this is that the sounds are a little more separated. This is because the solo instrument sits forward with more presence, cutting through the texture as a single voice, while the sectional voices are a little more fluffy, which is definitely a technical term. RVW uses this doubling divisi technique briefly in parts of Dives and Lazarus. The first time is at rehearsal mark A. Here he uses a solo cello on its A string to double a unison section of violas. The cello and its A string register are particularly good for this kind of doubling, as like most top strings on string instruments, it is the most brilliant, whereas the lowest is frequently the most iconic and sonorous, giving the most distinct sound of the instrument. The upper one is, as I've said, more brilliant and incisive, therefore it cuts through the textures with greater success. So moving on to Divisi-Section Doubling. This is similar to solo section and the same strings, different string example, in that they blend instruments from different sections. However, unlike solo section doubling, there is less extreme dimensionality in the sense that there is a single superimposed part laid on top of a section or divisi part. Similar to same strings, different string divisi techniques, however, this technique uses and blends the characteristics of different string sections as well as the timbre of divisi sections themselves. Doing so leads to a richer colour with plenty of instrumental numbers for the use of mixed timbres, strings and tessituras. If we look closely at the extract on screen, we can see a passage that uses divisi celli, divisi violas and unison first violins. The violins are also asked to play the passage on the G string. The line, despite being the main melodic interest here, is in the middle of the texture. Very briefly, is actually the lowest sustained arco voice. Each part is piano dynamic, so Vaughan-Williams chooses to rely on instrumental numbers and the interesting coloristic blend of these three instrument types to allow it to cut through the texture, come through. In this brief passage we'll not only have the sonorous G string coming from the first violins, we will also have the body of the distinctive viola sound and the brilliance of the cello on its A string. In this way we could start to visualise the sound as the cross-section of a cone or triangle, with the cello at the point, and then the violas in the midpoint, and then the violins at the base of this triangle or cone. We can then peer down on top of the cone and see a far more vibrant series of colours that could represent our sound, the timbral colours of this melodic line. So for this final section, divisi and sub-divisi by desk, for this last technique I can only really speculate on whether it offers a different timbral effect, or is consideration more of performance or player interaction. In one sense, a couple of comments have been made which I was highly appreciative of. Obviously, with regard to performance, divisi and sub-divisi by desks makes it easier for the players to just know how to divisi rather than talk amongst themselves, especially if they're divisying again. And also another thing that came up was how players interact with one another. Having divisi by desk, you have the player next to you, and it's thus easier to hear and manage intonation within a section. Offering my thoughts on this, so at several points of Dives and Lazarus, Vaughan-Williams specifies a divisi by desk, or for one desk to support another part. Typically there are two players to a desk within a string section. Obviously that depends on numbers and social distancing. Therefore a single divisi, not divising into three or more parts, tends to split each desk in half, so one person on the desk will play one part, the upper line or the lower line, and then the other one vice versa. So what happens is there is always a player on that desk playing one line, the other playing the other line. While this might require some negotiation depending on how the lines interact, dividing this way has become the natural orchestral behaviour, if you like, for string sections. They naturally do this. In the case of Dives and Lazarus, RVW frequently asks for a divisi of desks 1, 3 and 6 in one part and 2, 4 and 5 in the other. Sometimes, like in the example on screen, which is from variant 5, this seems to be a way of managing numbers and further divisis, sub-divisis that is, where the first trio of desks, 1, 3 and 6, take up a line that is in unison with the same set of desks on the violas. The second trio, 2, 4 and 5 on the cellos, divide again, so we end up with a 3-part divisi in the cellos, but 3 desks, so 6 players play one part, and then there's 3 players on the next part and 3 players on the last part. In cello too, the divisi will likely be a standard division across players on each desk. Therefore RVW can add a contingent of those players, 3 of the players, to double the second divisi of the first violins at the octave, adding some support and weight to that line. He's also able to blend the other 3 cellos with the double basses, either the octave or unison. It changes within the passage depending on registers. With some of these divisis, their use is self-explanatory. However, with some, we have to speculate on Vaughan-Williams' reasoning. However, in these observations and speculations we can start to spot interesting ways of enriching and experimenting with our own use of the string orchestra. These experimentations could be with a string orchestra alone, or the string orchestra within a wider orchestra, including brass and woodwind and things like that, percussion. Of course, many of us are limited to samples when it comes to string orchestras. I certainly cannot afford one on retainer. However, some of these are more than easy to experiment with while using sample libraries, especially given the growing form sample libraries come in with soloist and divisi performers. This being said, I would recommend any composer or orchestrator to look at using recording soloists to combine with their samples, even if they are restricted by smaller budgets. In my experience, it provides valuable learning and is very worthwhile and personally enriching. If you've enjoyed this video, then subscribe, click the little bell icon, like, and give us some feedback or questions below in the comment section. I've been George Marshall at Any Old Music. I hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.